Hello and welcome to the first in the interview series, Necessarily So. This is looking at essential knowledge and understanding that people have that is of a type that changes one's worldview, that allows things to be seen and understood in a different way. And a lot of it's going to concentrate on knowledge that people genuinely believe and is the conventional wisdom most people understand to be true that just isn't so, and on the implications of these new or different or radical ideas on how one sees the world. When I started to become involved in some campaigning inside Scotland, I was a foot soldier for the No to Name Person campaign, and I would go out in rainy Scottish streets and hand out leaflets and encourage people to get involved and oppose the government scheme for taking over families, for becoming hugely involved in the minutiae of family life and placing themselves above parents. And there was many other people who would turn out and campaign and hand out leaflets and take names and encourage the public to get involved. And these people who were active, I would always ask them, how come you're here? How come you are actually taking action? What was the thing that started you off realising that the government had to be opposed at times? And the most common answer by far, although we're dealing in an area of family law and the interests of children, the most common answer was 9/11. It was 9/11 and the realisation that all wasn't sound in the story of 9/11 that started most of these people off into an area where they could question government, where they could ask questions and they could hold government to a standard of response that, they found lacking in many cases. For that reason, I'm very delighted that this first episode is starting off with 9/11, starting off with Kevin Ryan, a 9/11 whistleblower who was on the record very early in the 9/11 process, as raising concerns, and who I know his work is very careful and very painstaking on the technical side, but it has also started to look at the wider implications of the government lying about 9/11 and what it means for our society. So I'm very delighted to welcome you here today, Kevin. Thank you for joining me, and if we could start off with where you were when 9/11 happened, what you were doing and how you got involved in the 9/11 truth movement.
Yes, thank you, David. I'm happy to be here with you. On September 11, 2001, I was working for a company called Underwriters Laboratories, also known as UL, and it's a company that tests many types of materials for safety purposes. It's a tax-free organization for that reason. And on 9/11, I was in my offices in South Bend, Indiana, working with my team there. And we began hearing about the towers being hit by aircraft. And my first concern was for my daughter who lived in Washington, D.C. at the time. So once I heard from her, I was feeling much better. I didn't think a lot about it immediately, but 2 weeks later, the CEO of our company came to our location and told us how UL had certified the steel components used to build the World Trade Center towers. And, he felt like we should be proud of how long the buildings had stood. And again, I didn't think very much in depth about this until 2003, when it was clear that the run-up to the Iraq War was based on a pack of lies. And I began asking when such lies might have started, and it certainly wouldn't have been the first time that such things had happened. And I realized that the World Trade Center Twin Towers had failed. One of them failed in 56 minutes. It collapsed in 56 minutes. Whereas the New York City Code which UL has tested the steel components to, required 3 to 4 hours of fire resistance in intense fire and in furnace testing conditions. So I began asking questions at UL among leadership there, both of the CEO and the head of the fire resistance testing division. As I said, I was the head of the environmental testing division. But they were not able to answer my questions, why the test results were not being considered carefully by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and actually the conclusions being drawn by that organization were in direct contradiction to their own test results. So I began asking questions and starting to raise the issue of this being very important to the lives and liberties of people around the world. And I was not able to get answers from my leadership, so I wrote directly to the National Institute of Standards and Technology and sent them a message asking about these details, mentioning that I work for UL. Another person I copied, because I know he was interested in the subject, was a professor in California named David Ray Griffin, who had written a book around the same time. He published a book called The New Pearl Harbor. And, it was clear that, becoming clear to a lot of us that 9/11 was a pretext, another Pearl Harbor and a pretext for war and for power grab. And so, I wasn't willing to take the message back and take it down. And 5 days after I sent it, I was fired by UL for basically harming, in their words, harming their relationship with their client NIST. Now, UL had been conducting part of the investigation with NIST at the time that I was there, testing floor assemblies for weakness. And they built these model floor assemblies that would match what was in the towers. And they tested those with more or less fireproofing, some samples with no fireproofing, more or less load on the floors. And the result was that the floors would not collapse. And this was a big issue because the pancake theory was the long-standing official account, at least through the media, this floor collapse theory. And so we were really left with no explanation, and I was left without a job. So I went on to do a lot of research in 9/11 and have many interesting experiences with citizen investigators and people seeking the truth.
Yes, I share a name. David Scott's quite a common name. I share a name with another engineer. In fact, I used to work for the same company. He worked in the Hong Kong office and I worked in the Glasgow office. And the company library used to confuse us, and I would get his books on earthquake engineering. And I have to point out that that was the wrong David Scott, and there were no earthquakes in Glasgow. And he subsequently made his career in America in the field of high-rise buildings. So when I went on the record raising concerns and calling for a new investigation, his mates were thinking it was him, and he found this very embarrassing. So he phoned me one night from America to sort me out, and it was a very interesting phone call. It wasn't a long one because we went through how robust the buildings were, and we went through how phenomenally strong they were and how much damage they could take, all of which he agreed with. And he said, but of course it was the fires. And when I said, well, the first building that came down, the firemen reached the scene of the fire, and this is what they reported. And I quoted what the firemen said, which was 3 or 4 small fires, a couple of lines will knock them down. And that was the end of the phone call. He ended it there and said he wouldn't contact me again, and off he went. Because this was key, right? Because people who are in the field, people who are structural engineers, people who are in the technical field, who are not dealing all the time with fire testing, don't have an awful lot of intuitive grasp of the temperatures we're talking about and how materials behave at those temperatures. But what he knew was that at up to around about 600 degrees C, and this was a temperature much higher than the sort of situation those firemen had described, steel has no loss of strength whatsoever. And the description that the firemen gave basically said fire wasn't the cause of the collapse. Now, it's very interesting that you had this much more extreme testing, and even under those conditions, the collapse couldn't be replicated. I'm very interested about the sacking, the idea that you're firing someone for speaking out. Was there any attempt to convince you were technically wrong?
No, that's a good question. There was never any question of being wrong on my part. It was about my judgment in sharing such information with the company's client and with the public. So it wasn't about whether my questions were invalid or my propositions were wrong. For example, there were tests done on steel samples, the very few steel samples that were saved from the World Trade Center towers. And you may know that 99.7% of the steel was whisked away for recycling in Asia. So it was taken away on GPS tracked trucks before any investigators ever arrived on the scene. But a few samples were saved. And this was really a quandary for NIST, and I'll explain this a little bit later, but they took samples from the impact zones of the towers, and they did tests. For example, they did a paint test. Just a simple paint test, and it measured, they built a calibration curve by painting steel samples and exposing them to a continuum of temperature, and then examining the cracking and microstructure of the paint that was exposed to various temperatures. And the result from the World Trade Center is that the steel did not experience temperatures above 250 degrees Celsius. So, that in itself, it gets to your point, David, that those temperatures are not sufficient to weaken or soften. And really, there were so many comments being made in the media, up to the extent of the steel melting across huge swaths of the building, melting. And then they changed that to softening, and then they changed that to weakening. Over a period of time, it became clear that none of this was valid. None of these comments could have happened, not with the temperatures that they received as results in the physical tests. So the reason I feel like this was a quandary, and I think most people would, is we learned that there was actually a lot of molten metal at the World Trade Center, pouring from the building, being pulled up in the pile at Ground Zero. Something was melting metal. Something was. So it's really a quandary, because on the one hand, we would say, hey, this 250 degrees Celsius result is not going to give you steel weakness or steel softening, and steel melting, for God's sake. That's certainly not going to occur. And then the people responding would say, well, the steel didn't have to melt. Nobody said the steel melted, but the truth was a lot of steel did melt. Not steel, but a lot of metal did melt. And what we found through physical testing ourselves, independent research teams, including myself, examined World Trade Center dust samples, and we found, first of all, the presence of a lot of tiny metallic microspheres, which we tested via elemental analysis and found that they were largely iron. So they weren't steel, they were almost pure iron. Pure iron like that is one result of a reaction called the thermite reaction. And so with the witnesses to molten metal, the video and photographic evidence of molten metal pouring out of the building, we determined that thermitic materials must have been present. And sure enough, we did find tiny chips of unreacted thermitic material in the World Trade Center dust scattered throughout multiple samples. And so, this was a big challenge to the official account. The fact that, first of all, they didn't really acknowledge the molten metal. They didn't test for explosives or incendiary materials in the World Trade Center dust or in the steel residues. So it became clearer and clearer to us that, among other things, this molten metal provided evidence for explosive demolition of all three buildings.
So, yeah, this is another very important point. Before we get to thermite, and whilst we're still talking about the temperature of the steel, the public view of this, I think, initially was very superficial, and that fires are very hot things, and there wasn't no one was asking the questions right at the start. But as these questions started to mount, they became very quickly obvious that they were very fundamental. We also saw video, right? And there's the records of firemen, etc., finding molten steel, and there's video of molten steel or molten metal being pulled out of the substructure, out of the basement of the Twin Towers, as the site clearance was undertaken. And there's also video of close to white hot metal pouring out of the towers themselves. Now, when you're talking about temperature, many people won't realise, but steel will glow at a particular colour at a particular temperature, and measuring the colour is a way of regulating the temperature. This is used on building sites to control how much heat is put into metal when it's being worked, to prevent changing its microstructure, to prevent damaging the structure of the steel. And at the temperatures that you get, yellow, bright orange, yellow, or white colours coming from steel, these are astronomically high temperatures. These are well in excess of anything that you can get from a hydrocarbon fire. So it just doesn't make sense. The hydrocarbon as generator of the temperatures is one of the huge problems in the official story, and one of the others is the collapse itself. So maybe before we go on to thermite and possible explanations, did you get involved in the discussion of why the collapse happened, the rate at which the collapse happened, and the mechanism of how the collapse happened?
Yeah, there were a lot of features of how the buildings collapsed that were really indicative of something other than a fire-based hypothesis. So there was a sudden onset of failure. We pretty much went from no collapse to immediate collapse at once. It wasn't a little bit of bending and twisting. And it was near free fall speed of collapse. This is true for both towers, which collapsed in approximately 10 to 12 seconds, near free fall speed for their heights. And World Trade Center 7 was even more so. And in fact, later on, the government did agree and admit that World Trade Center Building 7, the third tower, did fall at free fall for a period of time. It was symmetrical. The fall of the buildings were symmetrical, meaning, they came down through what should have been the path of most resistance. So I think we can all agree there's reason to believe the fires may have caused some sort of weakening to some extent, or some sort of a effect at some point in the impact zone. But the fact is, 90 stories of cold steel below that would not be crushed by the smaller section above. And it was symmetrical, straight down through the path of most resistance. There were many eyewitnesses to testimonies of explosions and flashes of light. There were small rubble piles, particularly World Trade Center Building 7, which fell into its own footprint. We mentioned the molten metal. There was dust clouds resembling pyroclastic flows, like from a volcano, as if there was hidden source of energy. Ejections of large pieces of steel structure at high speed, horizontally and even vertically. This all doesn't add up to what heat might do to a structure and causing it to weaken. And then, some of the early evidence for the thermitic material was that some of the samples from World Trade Center Building 7 had what are called sulfidation and intragranular melting. So on the microstructure level, we saw the official investigators saw and could not explain this intragranular melting of the steel and the sulfidation. And so, this all led to further investigation, as I said, into the thermitic hypothesis. And with sulfidation, it's as a matter of what's called thermate. So sulfate is part of the metal oxide and aluminum mixture that's part of thermite. So, Can I
ask you a little bit about the NIST response, the government response to this? Because we had these well-qualified NIST investigators. I had an opportunity to ask the designer of the highest building in the world what he thought of 9/11. And he said, well, my colleagues are the guys who work in NIST. And I know these men, and I trust them. And if they say there's nothing to see, I believe them. Now, he didn't go into any explanation of how the collapse happened, despite being an absolutely first-class engineer. He couldn't offer any explanation. He was simply deferring to his buddies, who used to work in the same company, who then moved on to NIST, as being beyond reproach, essentially. Now, I'm curious about this because NIST put forward their report at one point about one of the buildings. I think it was 7. It might have been one of the Twin Towers. And one of the people who'd got into the presentation was a high school physics teacher. And he'd got some software, and he'd used the software to show that it was free fall acceleration. And free fall acceleration for multiple stories. And the significance about free fall acceleration is all the potential energy is turning into kinetic energy. There is nothing in the way. No energy is being used to destroy anything. So free fall means there's nothing in the way. The structure's gone. Now, NIST engineers were not themselves pushing that. They were forced to admit that by this physics teacher. And God bless him. And then there was this reluctance to face up to the implication, because the implication is for 10, 11, 12, however many stories you could actually measure this as being in free fall, there was nothing in the way. Okay, what happened to the building? I don't know if you've had any direct exchange with the NIST engineers or a chance to take this forward on a more personal one-to-one basis or not, but have you any idea about how they can not address these issues? What's their justification for not facing up to the implications of what they now admit was the case?
Yeah, well, to your first point, I agree that there were a lot of good and dedicated professionals working on various parts of this compartmentalized investigation. But there were a few who were leading the public-facing discussions who clearly were intent on deception. And, so they never, the NIST investigation, first of all, never explained how the towers collapsed, right? If you're aware of their report, what they did in 10,000 pages is develop what they thought might be a collapse initiation sequence. So just how might it have initiated? And so that's where, they were testing these floor assemblies to see if the floor assemblies would pull in the perimeter columns or not. They didn't have evidence for that through the physical tests that my company did. So what they did is they put this temperature testing, these temperature results and these floor assembly results and whatever. They did a shotgun test, a very minor, actually one shotgun kind of proving that all the fireproofing on in the building was removed. They put all this into a computer model, and they said this computer model, if we take these different worst case scenarios, then it leads to something that could, in our minds, plausibly become a collapse initiation event. But then they didn't explain the dynamics of the collapse at all, because that's where a lot of the really difficult evidence to explain might be. The fact that there was no resistance really from the bottom part of the structure. There was no jolt, as we said in one of our papers at the Journal of 9/11 Studies, which, by the way, I've been the editor of the Journal of 9/11 Studies since 2006. We have over 160 peer-reviewed papers. You can find these papers more easily now at the International Center for 9/11 Justice, IC911.org, which, by the way, my friend David Chandler, who is the physics teacher you mentioned, he and I are among the board directors there. So David Chandler was the physics teacher who won the World Trade Center 7 report came out in 2008, joined their public comment period and mentioned that clearly, graphically, you can see that the building was in free fall for a period of time. So your question is, how could they say that was so without explosives and still pass the red phase test? Well, they couldn't. They were never able to explain how World Trade Center 7 collapsed in free fall. It is, as you said, it's the removal of all the steel structure over a period of over a span of 8 to 10 floors, and that just doesn't happen magically. It has to happen with some sort of mechanism to remove all the fasteners, all the connections, and make sure that there was no resistance whatsoever below the section falling. So, did I answer your question, David?
Yes, thanks. Thanks for that. It's a puzzle to me as to how. Well, you described it as the red face test. I think that's quite apt. The giggle test under less serious situation is what it'd be known as. At what point is the story just not credible? And and rather than an admission, and this comes to character. This is where I'm going with this question. It becomes no longer a technical question. It becomes a character question. If the position is that the technical answer points to there being no structure below, it becomes a character question as to whether that's admitted. And what I see is every time that subject comes up, the subject's changed or everyone just goes quiet. Nobody wants to address that issue, or the subject's changed to conspiracy theorists. And are you saying how could someone get in unobserved and put explosives in? And so you get all of the follow-on questions, but at no point is the core issue ever addressed. And this seems to be the pattern of how the cover-up is done, and it becomes a matter of integrity and honesty, I think, rather than technical knowledge because they must understand at this point what the technical problems of the position is. You mentioned that there's no explanation of how World Trade Center 1 and 2 came down in the main report. The only thing that they rely on is a paper by Bazant and Zhu, which was published, I think it was 2 days after the attack. Right? I mean, you wonder when they started writing it. And this is based on the small block at the top of the tower crushing everything below it and then crushing itself. And this flies in the face of the basic fundamentals of physics, where forces occur in pairs equal in magnitude and opposite in direction. In other words, if there's a force that's going to crush the bottom part of the building, the same force is pushing up against the upper part of the building, and the damage would occur in both. And the other issue to do with free fall is if you're going to get these enormous forces because a piece of the building is collapsing, that means that you're getting forces which are a multiple of gravity. So the piece that's collapsing is decelerating at a multiple of g. And in other words, there's a jolt, and you can view the video and there's no jolt. So none of this makes sense. And yet, from the official line, NIST, etc., we're just not going to talk about it. I don't know, have you anything else you'd like to add before we move on from the subject of integrity and having the guts to face the hard implications?
Right. Yeah. Your points are well made. I think that, your question initially was, at what point do people realize that we're not being forthright, that NIST is not being forthright about this? That's the way I heard what you said. And it goes through a period of time. If you're objective, you begin asking questions like I did. Then you see that the computer models were tweaked in very extreme ways to try to propose the collapse initiation. And then the computer models were not made available to the public. You may know that you said you were a structural engineer, but there's a structural engineer colleague of mine, Ron Brookman, who put in a FOIA request to NIST for their computer model parameters, and they refused to release those to the public, saying that doing so would jeopardize public safety, which, at that point, I think for most people, they realized with free fall and all the other characteristics of demolition that there's something being covered up at a high level here. And so, the fact that people are technically competent should not be confused with them being morally competent, right? Those are totally different things. And, I think most people, as they think about it, can realize that. So, the NIST organization definitely engaged in a cover-up, as did the FEMA group before them, although not quite to the same extent. And we're left with assuming that we're correct, that all three buildings were demolished through explosive demolition.
So I'd like to go into a few things about Building 7 now, but just before I do, the other point you made right at the start when you talked about being sacked from UL, the issue that these companies which are independent actually only have one client, and the client's the government, and their entire financial future requires them to please that one client. This puts enormous pressure on people's integrity, because are you willing to sacrifice the entire company and the livelihood of everyone you work with, including yourself, and not be able to pay the mortgage in order to tell the truth, right? And it is a lot to ask, but I maintain that if we're not prepared to do that, then we've started down a very slippery slope to doing horrible things to innocent people, if we're not prepared to tell the truth and say, I can't lie. Moving on to Building 7, because this was a special case, because obviously it wasn't hit by an aeroplane. It came down. due to office fires, it was said. And then we had the problem of the fact that it was the only fire protected steel frame building, high-rise building that ever collapsed due to office fires. And it did so at free fall acceleration, and it did so symmetrically and completely and all the rest of it. And people were asking questions, and there wasn't, year after year went on, and there wasn't an answer. And then FEMA came up with their answer, and they said of their own answer, it had a small probability of being true. And it was all based on a hypothesis that there was a rupture to the diesel supply to a generator, and it was the diesel fuel that was being pumped into the building that fueled the fire that caused the collapse. And then that was abandoned completely. And then NIST came up with something else entirely. This has all the indications of a narrative in disarray. What do you make of this?
Yeah, there were a number of media-driven official accounts for how World Trade Center Building 7 collapsed. They were long-standing, and that included the diesel tank hypothesis that you mentioned. It also included the hypothesis that massive damage was caused to World Trade Center 7 from debris falling from the North Tower. And in the end, the NIST group, when they released their reports in their report on Building 7 in 2008, disavowed all those previously held media stories. It was not the diesel fuel, we learned. It was not the damage. There wasn't sufficient damage from the debris from the towers to cause the collapse of Building 7. It was a very unusual, heretofore unseen structural event that initiated through something called thermal linear expansion. That is, there's a girder on the west side of the building that was slightly lengthened through because of thermal stress. So, certainly there is such a thing as thermal expansion, and the problem is that the thermal expansion given by NIST is an idea that, first of all, fires that were mostly out in this area, and that's very clear from photographic and video evidence. The fires were basically out already, but somehow it caused one girder to lengthen by a couple of inches, pushing a column over, a column 79, and once that one column buckled, according to NIST, that initiated an instantaneous, around the circumference of the building, immediate free fall collapse, right? And it's very hard to believe in itself. But they also created, they created animations that they put some of the photos of these animations in their report. And the animations, which look something like crumpled soda cans, for example, in some areas, just don't reflect the reality of the photographic evidence of what happened to Building 7. It didn't crumple like a soda can and lean over in the middle of like these animations did. As we talked about, it collapsed straight down, immediately, straight down. And, the other things we can see are there's these little squibs going up the side of the building, little ejections of debris going up, almost as if the building was being imploded. So, there's a lot to be said about World Trade Center Building 7. There are witnesses in and around the building. There's a famous witness named Barry Jennings, who is a New York City employee, was trapped in the building with the New York City Council, Michael Hess, and they testified to explosions going off in the building. Barry Jennings did. Unfortunately, he died of mysterious circumstances around the time that the report was released, so he can't say anything more, but he definitely held to his story. And there are a lot of witnesses around the area that talked about the building's going to come down, it's going to be blown up, and at the Journal of 9/11 Studies, we have papers that talk about these witnesses. So feel free, particularly papers by the Professor Graham McQueen, who recently passed away, a very important 9/11 investigator from Canada. He wrote several papers on the witnesses. And so World Trade Center Building 7 definitely was a mistake that was made in some way.
Well,
I
yes,
think,
including the witnesses, including the BBC, who predicted it,
yeah, right.
much to their continuing embarrassment. That video won't go away. Now, this is an area where there's been a lot of work done recently by an Alaskan-based university. Could you bring us up to date on what that has found?
Yeah, there was a research study on World Trade Center Building 7 that did finite element analysis. So this is a largely mathematical engineering study where all of the components of the building were modeled within a computer model, and the known stressors were added and modeled. And this was led by Professor Leroy Halsey at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks. And he and his graduate students did this study and determined that the building could not have collapsed in the way that NIST said, that the fire and damage that was known to have existed in Building 7 would not have caused the building to collapse. And they indicated that they had support for the demolition hypothesis, which of course is the most obvious given the evidence that we know. Now that study, few people know that study was originated through the hard work of an independent citizen named John Teal, who was I believe he was a nurse in South Carolina. And he was just very adamantly interested in getting to the truth about 9/11. And so he looked for academic groups to do studies, and he finally secured Leroy Halsey's group as being willing to do this. And then he was taken on by other groups like Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth to kind of trumpet and sponsor the event, raise the money to help pay for some of it. But yeah, there's a movie called Seven. If you haven't seen the movie, it's a very compelling movie. It should be available online. It's just Seven, SEVEN, and it's a documentary about Leroy Halsey and his team and their study of Building 7.
Yeah, I mean, I was watching early parts of this as they were putting out some initial findings about how they were modelling the building, and from a purely technical basis, I was very impressed. It seemed a fine piece of work, and that was very much not the reaction I had to such modelling information as was available from the NIST explanation, which seemed to be modelling the impossible. You know, they were considering a beam suffering thermal expansion, but all the structure round about it not, because otherwise you wouldn't get the differential movement necessary to trigger the event that they say caused the collapse. So the NIST modelling, the official modelling, seemed to be very much defective, and the modelling from the Alaskan University quite the opposite, quite thorough and precise and of very high quality. And of course, when their final report came out, they were absolutely adamant that the only scenario that they could generate that would replicate the failure that was shown in the video record was all the columns being cut at the same instant, more or less, which means controlled demolition. And that brings us into the area of the follow-on, the non-technical follow-on. And this is where I'm not at all up to date on this now, on the view as to who, why. Is there any movement on that? Are there any whistleblowers coming out? Is there anything more known about possible scenarios, possible explanations as to the how and the who and the why, if we accept that the physical evidence points very strongly towards controlled demolition and without any other viable explanation that actually matches the evidence.
Yeah, well, you can imagine that it's unlikely, and to date it is the fact that no one has stepped up to admit that they participated in the murder of 3,000 people on 9/11 that led to the murder of almost 5 million people around the world through the 9/11 wars. Now, nobody has admitted that, but it's not terribly surprising. But one thing, I spent the first, I was fired in 2004. I spent 5 years doing scientific study of 9/11 and helping to publish many peer-reviewed papers, not only at the Journal of 9/11 Studies, but also in mainstream scientific journals. And I mentioned some of that. Then I did turn my attention to how and who might have these things occurred. And so, one thing I started to look into is who had access to the World Trade Center buildings. And I wrote a series of articles called Demolition Access to the World Trade Center, as a 4-part series of articles, and looked at tenants and security companies and the cleanup people and all of that. So, one company really stood out. It was the company that controlled the major part of security for the World Trade Center complex. They controlled the electronic badging, the security gates, and the closed circuit television throughout the World Trade Center complex. This is a company called Stratisec, and it was led by a man who is said to be the cousin of President George W. Bush. There is a distant relation there, but not significant. But George W. Bush's brother was on the board of this company as well. So it was managed by a Kuwaiti company, owned by a Kuwaiti company, QAM, Kuwaiti American company. And this company, Stratisec, had contracts for not only the World Trade Center, but also for Dulles Airport, where one of the planes took off, and for United Airlines, that owned 2 of the other planes. So it was very much of interest to me. I began looking into the leaders of this company, and the top 2 leaders were the CEO, Wirt Walker, who not only has a career that parallels that of CIA officers, known CIA officers like Ted Shackley, but he also has a long family history of kind of a deep state operational, going back to the Russell and Company folks who bought up all the infrastructure in the United States. And then there's Barry McDaniel, who's the chief operating officer of Stratisec. And he is a guy who worked for black operations companies previously through the Vanell Corporation and BDM International, the companies of the Carlyle Group. You may have heard of the Carlyle Group. And at the time of 9/11, the head of the Carlyle Group, at the time, Frank Carlucci, was meeting with members of the Bin Laden family and George H.W. Bush. So there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that this company, Stratisec, was involved in either providing access for those to wire the buildings with explosives or helping to do it themselves, because it turns out that Barry McDaniel was an expert on the explosive ordnance that would be needed. He used to be the head of the U.S. Army Material Command around the time of Iran-Contra, which implicates him in that crime as well. So what I did is I started looking at these, and David, if you're not aware, I wrote a book called Another 19, Investigating Legitimate 9/11 Suspects, in which I provided, there you are, I provided 19 other than the accused alleged hijackers, 19 other powerful men within the U.S. government and corporate infrastructure who were in position. They did have the means, the motive, and the opportunity to cause all of the aspects of 9/11 to occur, not just the destruction of the World Trade Center buildings. But this book can be found online for free now at the International Center for 9/11 Justice. So your viewers can go to ic911.org and they can look under republished books and find my book there for free if they're interested in who might have done the crimes.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. It's a very good book. I would heartily recommend people get a hold of this, either by free or if you want to support Kevin Ryan's work, via Amazon or other booksellers. And that kind of brings us, I think, to present day. Do you sense that we're now, 20, 22 years on, 23 years on, where despite the passage of time, or maybe even because of the passage of time, there's a new mood in the country and people are looking afresh at 9/11. It's maybe been on the back burner for some years, but it's not there anymore. Do you feel there's renewed interest and a renewed eagerness to understand what actually happened? Do you feel a new mood in America?
Yeah, I think there is around the world a renewed interest. And I think that largely comes from what I call the COVID crimes, which I believe you're well versed in. It would be an entirely new show for us. But the crimes of COVID, the deception of COVID, as people realize that, and how it was driven globally and through these organizations that could be considered deep state organizations like the World Economic Forum and even the World Health Organization. I think people realized that COVID was a lie to some extent, if not entirely. I think for me, it's to some extent. I think that COVID certainly was co-opted, if not planned from the beginning to be a deception. And when people realize that, then like I did with the Iraq war, you begin to ask, well, when might have these kinds of things started to happen? And, has it happened before? Oh, 9/11 is something that people talk about. Yeah, so I've been invited on a couple of high visibility podcasts recently, and the International Center for 9/11 Justice is renewing interest and research into 9/11 as well.
Yes, I mean, COVID changed so many things for so many people because it brought the oppression to every home, just as I suppose the critical moment in the Vietnam War was the draft, when it brought the war to every home in America, rather than simply a volunteer army, and it's the military families that are carrying the burden. The oppression, the lies, the deception, the falsification of evidence, the lack of any integrity in the expert class who assured us all they knew best, the now admitted inability of them to actually justify any of the policy positions that they were 2 years ago assuring everyone was vital. We've now got Mr. Fauci, who's up on Capitol Hill, and he's explaining that the 6 feet rule and social distancing, well, he doesn't know where it came from. Someone just made it up, and it seemed like a good idea at the time, and why not? And this was the science. He said, I am the science, and then when questioned, we find he's a man of straw. There's nothing there. That, I think, is having an effect, and people are drawing the obvious conclusion. If that wasn't sound, if that was a lie, if that was a fabrication or an exaggeration, or was responded to in a manner that is not logical and reasonable, what else is not logical and reasonable? And I think that does take you down the road to 9/11 very directly. The failure of the expert class alone is enough of a commonality between the two. That's. Is there anything else that you would like to say about where we are today before we close? Is there anything else that you see as an opportunity or a particularly the challenge or cutting edge of 9/11 studies as a topic?
Yeah, well, there are things we're working on at IC 9/11, and we are sponsoring, for example, the efforts of a British family, the Campbell family, to get a new inquiry within their own country. Matt Campbell is the brother of a British man named Jeff Campbell, who died on 9/11, and he's been pursuing a new inquiry based on the fact that he received remains of his brother, and when that happens, that he has legally the right to demand an inquiry into what happened, and he's stating that the official U.S. investigation into what happened does not satisfy, and therefore we're helping him pursue that. So that's one thing you can see if you're interested in learning about or supporting it. Go to ic911.org. There are other things we have on the agenda, including increased research. We'll be publishing a research agenda soon that will outline the details of what we hope to see. So if people want to participate by doing research themselves, submitting to the Journal of 9/11 Studies, for example, they should be able to do that. But yeah, there's still much to be done. It's still very important that people realize the need for 9/11 truth and how it fits in with overall the kind of the deep state events and the state crimes that we've seen over many years.